latest Notestein seminar, my handlers tell me that I have to start the show to keep the speaker in line. I'm not a planned speaker. I wasn't invited. We had a cancellation owing to illness in one of our speakers' families. And I asked a few of our recently arrived colleagues if they wanted to make a presentation on a week's notice, and nobody took me up on it. And there's this tradition at Texas A&M University of the 12th man, where if somebody goes down on the football field, somebody from the audience is willing to run and take the position on the line. So I'm the 12th man today, and I'm filling in to give the seminar, so you don't miss a free lunch. This is a paper that I'm going to be presenting at a conference at Michigan State University that's coming up in about a week and a half. And it's more for a popular audience, but it's based on a lot of work that I've done. So, as you know, Trump famously, in his presidential announcement of candidacy, doubled down on a long-standing bet in the United States that somehow border enforcement is going to solve our problems with immigration. By saying when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best, they're sending people with lots of problems, they bring the problems with us, drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. Okay? It's coming from more than Mexico, it's coming from all over South and Latin America. And it's probably coming probably from the Middle East, conflating Mexican immigration with terrorism. But we don't know because we have no protection, we have no competence, we don't know what's happening. It's got to stop, and it's got to stop fast. I will build a great wall, and nobody builds better walls than me. Believe me, and I'll build them very inexpensively. I will build a great wall on our southern border, and I will have Mexico pay for that wall. Mark my words. Throwing more money and resources at border enforcement is hardly a new strategy in the United States. This really comes off an old bet that was placed a long time ago, and it was articulated in a document produced by the Border Patrol in 1994, articulating a new strategic plan for the agency. The plan said that the mission of the United States Border Patrol is to secure and protect the external boundaries of the United States, preventing illegal entry and detecting, interdicting, and apprehending undocumented migrants, smugglers, contraband, and other violators of the law. And the Border Patrol is going to achieve this through a new strategy of prevention through deterrence. And the quotes are in the original document. The Border Patrol will achieve the goals of its strategy by bringing a decisive number of enforcement resources, I think I skipped a line, to bear on each of the entry corridors. The Border Patrol will increase the number of agents on the line and make effective use of technology, raising the risk of apprehension high enough to be an effective deterrent. The prediction is that with traditional smuggling routes disrupted, illegal traffic will be deterred or forced over more hostile terrain, less suited for crossing and more suited for enforcement. Previously, resource allocation strategies have sprinkled resources to all border locations. However, the magnitude of the increase in any given sector has not provided the decisive concentration of resources necessary to increase the cost, again in quotes, and that's in the original document, to illegal migrants to the point of deterring attempts. So, very clearly articulated, massive show of resources at the border. It's going to start with the busiest border crossings, hoping to divert them into nasty territory, which might discourage them from coming. The origins of the bet go back in time. In 1986, Reagan signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which began a process of border militarization that was disconnected from the actual volume of underlying migration. And began long, slowly rising buildup of border resources. In 1993, in the Clinton administration, Silvestre Reyes, who was the Border Patrol chief in El Paso, Texas, on his own initiative launched Operation Blockade, which he later modified to call Operation Hold the Line because the Mexican government complained. And it was the first effort at an all-out militarization of a specific sector of the border. And it was very successful. And Reyes rode that success to get himself elected into Congress for about 6 terms until he lost the election to Beto O'Rourke, who is currently challenging Ted Cruz for the Senate in Texas. The Clinton administration took note that the massive enforcement operation and Operation Blockade in El Paso was actually quite popular in El Paso. People had grown tired of migrants passing through that sector. They weren't really doing any damage. They were more of a nuisance than anything else. And this proved to be a very popular policy. Janet Reno then and the Democrats had an appearance they did a highly publicized tour at the Mexico-U.S. border and held a press conference articulating this new strategy that they were going to be developing called prevention through deterrence. And Bill Clinton later took credit for it in 1996, running for a second term. He stated that reversing decades of neglect, the administration has dedicated unprecedented resources and enforcement effort to curtailing illegal migration. Our overwhelmed comprehensive strategy to restore the rule of law to illegal immigration has done more in 30 years, that should be 3 years, than was done in 30 years before. So border enforcement has been a bipartisan policy. And since the original bet was made, roughly around 1993 with the launching of Operation Blockade and then Operation Gatekeeper, it's been a bet that's been doubled down by every successive president. Everybody comes into office promising to restore order to the border. Obama came into office in 2008 and 2009, and the first thing he did was increase the size and funding for the Border Patrol. It ended up being a very big bet. This is the Border Patrol's budget in real terms, in 2016 constant dollars. You see that from 1965 to 1985, it was fairly flat, even declining a bit. And with IRCA in 1986, it begins a slow rise, which is increased after the Operation Blockade is launched. And then when the USA Patriot Act is passed, it goes on steroids. And it reaches $3.9 billion, where it's more or less fluctuated around close to $3 to $4 billion since then. And since 1986, we've spent $62 billion in real dollars to to militarize the Mexico-U.S. border. And this has been costly in lives as well as money. So the solid line shows the deaths that have been recorded. Is probably an underestimate because a lot of bodies disappear in the desert. And to date, we've had about 8,644 deaths at least. And the death rate has steadily risen and is now at very high and record levels because the number of people crossing the border has actually fallen dramatically. So the key assumptions, which are articulated in the document that I showed you earlier, alien apprehensions will decrease as the Border Patrol increases control of the border. Violence will increase as the effects of the strategy affect, so they expected violence to break out. Rapid increase in personnel and equipment will reduce time required to achieve control of the border. Improvements in technology will make border control strategies more effective and less resource intensive. Control of border will reduce the INS, Immigration Naturalization Service, cost and produce more efficiency. And valid measures of effectiveness of border control and systems are needed to adjust enforcement efforts and reach strategy objectives. They have never really provided any of that valid measures of effectiveness. They make assertions, but they don't show any data, they don't present any measures. To my knowledge, the only real data that's ever done it has been the data collected by the Mexican Migration Project. So it didn't take long for the bet to go bad. It was supposed to bring new efficiencies and fewer resources. The solid line shows the number of apprehensions per Border Patrol agent as an indicator of agency efficiency. And you see it was rising through the 60s and mid-1970s, but when IRCA passes in 1986, it starts to plummet. The more and more you spend on, and the more and more people you put into border enforcement, the less effective you become. And the apprehensions per capita dropped from about 474 in 1983 to today's low of 15.6. So we've got 20,000 Border Patrol officers on the border now, and each of them in the course of a year catches an average of about 16 people, instead of the 2,000 officers that were there, or probably about 3,000 in 1985, who were catching about 474 per officer. And the cost per apprehension has skyrocketed. It bottomed out at about $98 per apprehension in 1983, and since then it's skyrocketed, and it's currently we're spending $12,521 for each apprehension we get. So it hasn't increased in efficiency. It hasn't increased efficiency. It hasn't increased effective use of resources. It also didn't have an effect on the apprehension rate. This uses Mexican Migration Project data to calculate the probability that you get caught on any given attempt at an undocumented crossing. The dashed line shows the probability on any given attempt, and the solid line at the top shows the probability of ultimate success in entering the United States over a series of attempts. And you see the probability of apprehension has never been above 0.41 on any given attempt. It's gone down, it's gone back up a bit, and now it's actually at very, very low levels. And you see at the top that through 2007, the likelihood of getting in over a course of a series of attempts was close to a 1.0, never falling below 0.96. And in 2007, of course, you may or may not know, illegal migration from Mexico to the United States basically stopped and has been negative ever since. So during the time of the boom in migration, the odds of getting in were extremely high. It did have big effects on the circumstances at the border, although not the ones that they had hoped for. Didn't raise the probability of apprehension, did not raise the likelihood that somebody, did not affect the likelihood of getting in over a series of attempts. It did, however, change the geography of border crossing by pushing people away from traditional crossing sectors. This graph shows the proportion of unauthorized border crossings through Tijuana, Mexicali, or Juarez. That's San Diego, Calexico, and El Paso. And you see that prior to 1986 or so, 1989, 70 to 80% of all crossings occurred in these traditional places, and 2/3 occurred in the San Diego sector alone, into California alone. And then there was a massive drop. And I don't show the lines here, just to keep the graph simple, but what happened was the diversion of the flows away from California in a huge way, diverting them through the Sonoran Desert and into Arizona. And Arizona became the most important point of border crossing. And Arizona, until 1986, had been a backwater on the border. And Arizona hadn't received significant Mexican immigration since the 1920s. And then it became a hotbed of immigration and anti-immigrant sentiment with Sheriff Joe Arpaio, America's toughest sheriff. By pushing people away from built-up urbanized areas where crossing was relatively straightforward and out into very remote territory, the costs of border crossing went way up. So you see from 1965, these are again in constant 2016 dollars, and using data from the Mexican Migration Project, that the cost of border crossing actually fell from 1965 to 1985 as migrant networks formed to connect people to border smugglers on the border. Border smuggling during this era was a mom and pop operation where somebody from your village or from your region would go across the border a number of times, learn how to do it, and then stay in Tijuana and then provide services for everybody else that they're connected to. And the cost dropped and bottomed out at about $800 a pop. And then you push people away from Tijuana, San Diego, or Juarez, El Paso, out of urban areas into remote desert or really wild territory in the lower Rio Grande Valley, and the cost goes way up. And since 2014, the cost has averaged about $5,128. So it dramatically increased the cost. and dramatically increased the death rate along the border. So you can see that the death rate steadily rose from 1990 to about 2007, and then since 2007 has gone way up. It's gone way up because the number of deaths that we know about along the border has maintained at fairly high levels, but the number of attempted crossings has dropped dramatically. And so the rate has gone way up. So this created a new situation at the border after the beginnings of the border militarization in '96, and especially during the 1990s. Migrants knew that if they went north and tried to get across, the odds of getting caught were actually not much higher, and the odds of ultimately getting in were extremely high. But the costs, the out-of-pocket costs, were rising very fast. And the risks, even though they're low, they're non-trivial. So costs and risks go up, the odds of a successful crossing don't change, the odds of apprehension don't change. What's a poor migrant to do? Minimize border crossing. And they minimize border crossing not by staying in Mexico, but by once they've paid the costs and gotten to the United States, you just keep prolonging going home. And the net effect was that the rate of return migration, the probability of return migration plummeted. So here is the probability of taking a first undocumented trip to the United States. And as you can see, it rose rapidly from 1965 to the late 70s. The Mexican oil boom happens, it drops. The Mexican crisis happens, it goes up. NAFTA happens and it goes down. The economic boom of the 1990s happens and there's tremendous labor demand in the US, it goes up. And then after 2000 it begins to fall, and it's really now down close to levels of zero. That decline has nothing to do with the border enforcement effort. I'll tell you about that in just a second. Here is the probability of return migration, which begins to decline pretty quickly after 1986 and then accelerates over time and then plummets. So now if you get in, you really don't go back unless you're deported. And in this article in the American Journal of Sociology, Jorge Duran and Karen Pren and I did an instrumental variable analysis to estimate the causal effect of increased border enforcement, and that's the dashed line. And you see to the left, the dashed line shows the causal effect of border enforcement on the probability of leaving for the United States on a first undocumented trip, which is zero, which is flat. And you see the dashed line on the right-hand graph shows the causal effect of militarization of the border on the likelihood of returning home. And that pretty much clearly predicts the downward trend that we observe. So what predicts the downward trend in the probability of departure for the United States? It turns out that the dotted line there is the average age of people eligible to migrate in Mexico. In the 1960s and really into the early 1970s, the total fertility rate in Mexico was 6.5 children per woman. And the average age of the population was about 17 or 18. Mexico, starting in the sexenio of López Portillo in the 1970s, put a lot of money into family planning with a lot of help from people like the Pop Council in order to, as part of a development strategy, to bring down their fertility rate and promote economic development in the nation. And they were very successful. And the fertility rate steadily declined with increasing rapidity over the years, and today it stands at 2.2 children per woman, replacement level. And Mexico has become an aging population. So in the 1960s and early 70s, the average age was 17. Today is 29. And like most demographic processes, labor migration is very age dependent. So it starts rising in the late teens, peaks around 22, 23, then starts to fall and then accelerates the decline to age 30, and then after 30, you're not likely to start migrating. And pretty much Mexico's aged out of the migrant-prone years. The average age is now 29 for the entire nation. And if you look at the people who are eligible of beginning a labor migration, say age 16 and above, in the Mexican Migration Project data, the average age is 47. So I think that undocumented migration from Mexico is basically over and won't be coming back. because the demography just doesn't support it anymore. The number of children is down to around 2 kids per family, even in rural areas that have long sent migrants to the United States. And levels of education have risen, and there are no returns to education if you're in undocumented status in the United States, but there are in Mexico. And contrary to many of what you might read in the papers, the middle class has actually increased in Mexico. So, and finally, one last thing explains the lack of migration from Mexico now, and that's the availability of legal opportunities for entry. Quietly, without any fanfare, Congress has increased the opportunities for temporary labor. And currently, between 350 and 400,000 Mexicans are entering the United States every year for temporary labor on various kinds of visas. You're probably all familiar with the H visas, but that's only a part of it. There are a lot of other visas. There are investor visas, there are business visas, there are visas for intra-company transferees, and Walmart is now the largest employer, private employer in Mexico. Exchange visas, all kinds of visas, and there's a new category of visas, the TN visa, the temporary NAFTA visa, which is a labor visa for people with more skills. And unlike the H visas, they don't expire. They can be renewed indefinitely. And so last time I checked, there were between 50 and 100,000 entries of TN visas every year in the U.S. So between the temporary visas at 350 to 400,000 per year, plus legal permanent residents, 3/4 of whom are relatives of U.S. citizens and are thus exempt from numerical limitation in entry, we're getting around 500,000 or more labor migrants coming into the United States each year. These migrants, the temporary ones particularly, but also the permanent residents, are increasingly circulating back and forth rather than staying. Because if you're in a family with undocumented migrants, the undocumented migrants can't go home and come back, but the legal ones can. So they're the ones that go back to take care of family affairs. So the rates of return migration for legal immigrants have increased. The rates of return migration for illegal migrants have declined and are basically both zero. So we're kind of at a status quo in Mexico. But during the 1990s, especially, the net increase in undocumented migration rose because we implemented a massive border policy that had no effect on in-migration but had a huge effect in reducing out-migration. So that naturally increases net migration, the balance equation, and it actually accelerated undocumented population growth by around 83%. And you can see this. This is I'm using Homeland Security's own estimates here, but they're the same if you use Pew estimates or the Center for Migration Studies estimates. You see kind of a linear increase starting around the mid-1972 or 73, going up to around 1996, with the exception of that downward shift. That is the Immigration Reform and Control Act's legalization of about 2 million illegal migrants. So in 1998, we have 1.9 million. And it got up to 5 million, and then suddenly the rate of growth accelerated, and by 2007 we have about 12 million people in the U.S. And since then it's fluctuated around 11. The evidence suggests that the Mexican population, illegal population, is declining slowly, probably because of deportations. And the only action left on the border at this point is Central Americans. So this shows the change in the undocumented population as estimated in the prior figure in 5-year increments, and you see that Mexico grows in the 1990s and early 2000s, then begins to decline, and then goes negative after the year 2007. And Central Americans had always been there. But when Mexicans disappeared, they became the visible migrants on the border. And this created a narrative of something new that was happening, but in fact nothing new is happening. So why are Central Americans persisting and migrating to the United States? Well, one more little point, just to set the stage. So now only Central Americans are left, and And in 2017, we had the lowest number of apprehensions along the Mexico-U.S. border in 46 years. You have to go back to 1971 to get to a level of apprehension that we observed in 2017. So naturally, since traffic along the southern border is the lowest in 45 years, it's the perfect time to build a wall and spend $25 billion doing it. In 1971, there were about 1,500 Border Patrol officers. And in 1917, there were about 20,000. And yet they're catching the same number. That's the apprehensions per agent that we saw earlier. And if you go back to the apprehensions per agent, you have to go back to the early 1940s to get levels as low as we observed now. So the percent of Mexicans apprehended at the U.S. border has steadily fallen, and in 2017 was down to 42%. Essentially what's happened is that a large flow dominated by Mexican laborers has been replaced by a much smaller flow of mainly families and children trying to escape terrible conditions in Central America. So since the total flow is way down, you'll notice that the Trump administration keeps talking about the increase in undocumented migration by talking about since last month. Oh, it's up 20,000 apprehensions since last month. Well, you can see that apprehensions were always highly seasonal. These are monthly apprehensions. In 2000, they peaked in March at about 220,000. And in 2000, there were 1.6 million apprehensions. Today, there are 340,000 apprehensions. And the peak year is down to around, is still in March. But the peaks and troughs have flattened out considerably. In 2018, you can see that from February to March, there was an increase. And Trump was furious. He called out his national security advisor, dressed her down, the head of Homeland Security. How could you be letting this happen? There's an increase. We need more border enforcement. We got to build that wall. But it's actually tiny compared to what we used to observe along the Mexico-U.S. border. So in many ways, we don't really have a border crisis. The border crisis we have is largely manufactured at this point. And there's no sign that we're going to be returning to the mass levels that we observed in the 1990s. And these were the people that were born in the 60s and 70s. And now we're getting people coming into the United States that were born in the late 90s and early 2000s when the fertility rate was already down to 2.3 children per woman. So why are Central Americans coming here and Mexicans aren't? Well, there wasn't any Central American migration, really, before the U.S. intervention in the 1980s. So in 1979, the Sandinistas topple the Somoza regime, and Carter dithers around, and then Reagan is elected, and in 1981 really comes to office with a promise to fully prosecute the Cold War and challenge the Soviet Union at every opportunity. The Sandinistas are a leftist regime with friendly ties to the Soviet Union and Cuba. And so the Reagan administration decides to intervene politically and militarily in the region in a very big way. And so you can see that before then, this is legal immigration. Before then, it was very modest. And then it increases, and then the peak violence is in the mid to late 1980s. And you can see it skyrockets. And then the peace accords come in 87, 88. Sandinistas leave power in 1990, and it goes back down. But you don't go back to the status quo ante. Why? Because now all these people have been displaced to the United States, and you have 2 million Central Americans with relatives back home facing miserable conditions. And so by pushing them into the United States, it creates social ties between a lot of people in Central America and migrants in the United States, and family reunification is occurring, and undocumented migration and documented migration is persisting. This is from the Latin American Migration Project, estimating the probability of taking a first undocumented trip from the region. And you see pretty much the same kind of pattern, only more, kind of a fatter curve going up. More people are coming without documents because it's hard to get documents to go. And you notice that whereas the legal peaks in 1990, this peaks in 1989, and that's because this charts the year they left without documents. The data from the Office of Immigration Statistics presents the year you got your green card. So that's a lot of those people were adjusting status from other kind of temporary status. And there was a lot of out-migration from the region, from Salvador and Guatemala, where the United States had trained and armed death squads that were persecuting the indigenous Mayan peoples, particularly, and lots of massacres and lots of deaths. And Honduras was the main base for launching the Contra War, the Contra invasion, a couple 100,000 person army that was secretly armed and funded by the United States, with the sole goal of toppling the Sandinista regime. So there are a lot of displacements from Nicaragua as well. U.S. immigration policy opened a red carpet to Nicaraguans coming because they were fleeing the tyranny of the leftist Sandinistas. But people from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras couldn't possibly be refugees because they were fleeing right-wing regimes allied with the United States, so they were labeled as economic migrants and denied any kind of asylum or refugee status. Most entered in undocumented status. A few ended up getting temporary protected status, which Trump is now revoking. But they're mostly in precarious or undocumented legal statuses. So it's pretty clear that something happened when the Sandinistas came to power. The U.S. intervened in a very direct way. And then the Sandinistas go out of power, the Cold War ends, and we wash our hands and just go away from it. But we really wrecked the region. This shows GDP per capita in the frontline and non-frontline nations of Central America. Frontline being Nicaragua, Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Non-frontline, Belize, Costa Rica, and Panama. And so you can see that GDP, those countries were always less well off than Panama and Costa Rica particularly. They're going up more or less kind of in parallel, they're widening a bit. And then 1978, just before the Sandinistas come to power, the frontline nations, the GDP per capita peaks, bottoms out in 1989. And it's not until 2011 that they get back to where they were in 1978 in terms of GDP per capita. So it's like a permanent tanking of the economy over a very long period of time. And this is a simple extrapolation of what you might have seen if it had gone on in a linear fashion. It would even be higher if it accelerated as it did in the other frontline and the non-frontline areas. But you can see that it really created a long period of economic stagnation and turmoil. We also created endemic violence, arming death squads, helping to train paramilitary groups, countenancing massacres that we know that the government's participated in, but the Reagan administration at the time denied. And we don't have good data on violence that was occurring in the 70s and 80s. We don't start picking up reliable statistics until the 1990s, but by then you can see that the frontline nations have a very high endemic level of violence. This is homicide rates. 1995 it was 53.9 per 100,000 compared to 111.9 in the non-frontline states. And the gap has really persisted. Mortality has risen even in the non-frontline states, but it's nowhere near as great as it is in Central America. And El Salvador has one of the highest murder rates in the world. And part of this just is an outgrowth of the civil violence that was indigenous to the region, with peasant groups fighting repressive governments, with leftists fighting guerrillas fighting paramilitary rightists. But another factor is the export of violence from the United States back to Central America. So these are deportations from frontline and non-frontline Central American countries. And you can see that there wasn't much in the way of deportation immediately afterwards, and we really didn't start deporting big numbers until there's a bump here in 1989, and then another bump here. But it's really not until the 21st century that deportations really take off. But a lot of those people deported were from El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras, especially El Salvador. And they went to places like California, where a lot of research shows they fared very badly. Mexicans have been coming to destination areas for decades, many decades. They had well-developed social networks, well-developed infrastructure, well-developed institutions. So Mexican migrants were doing fine, and they got jobs, and they took care of themselves. The Salvadorans especially arrived, and their social ties are very fragmented. They don't have a lot of social capital accessible to help them navigate America. They don't have legal status. They're in temporary protected status. They don't have a community there. The Mexicans don't exactly open their arms and help them because, of course, they're under pressure as well. And for the younger kids who went into schools, a lot of them did okay. But for people who were like 13 or 14 when they came, they don't go back into the schools, into the U.S. schools. They don't do well. And they end up on the streets in Los Angeles, and they end up in gangs. And Mara Salvatrucha is founded in the mid to late 1980s in the Pico Rivera neighborhood of Los Angeles. And Mara Salvatrucha becomes a very violent gang in California. And they start running afoul of the law and getting deported. So you see that even though the numbers of deportations were not very high, there's a huge increase in criminal deportations in the late 90s and early 2000s. And a lot of those people are gang members, Maras, being deported back to El Salvador, which is a small country of about 5 million people. And what you see here is the cumulative number of criminal deportations. So by 2016, we had deported about 160 people for criminal reasons. Now, this, I think, is indicating real criminality that developed in the United States and ended up deporting. It's harder to interpret later stuff because we criminalized so many things having to do with immigration that didn't used to be criminal offenses, used to be civil offenses. But now they're criminalized. So the criminal statistics are very inflated for that reason. And about 10 years ago, or 8 years ago, Homeland Security stopped publishing the actual charge that you're being deported for. So it's all just one category, criminal. So it looks like there's more and more criminals being deported, but if you just hold constant definitions, the actual what we call crimes, like violent crimes, robbery, rape, murder, those have stayed fairly low. It's things like identity theft, using a false passport, or being in the United States illegally has been criminalized. It used to be a simple civil infraction, and they still go to civil courts. They don't go to criminal courts, so they have the worst of both worlds. They don't have access to a lawyer. They don't have any rights, because it's a civil court, not a criminal court, and yet they're being charged and treated as criminals. So, why are they migrating? We messed up their region really bad, and then people left, and we didn't do anything to help the people we displaced if they were not from Nicaragua, and a lot of them ended up in criminal gangs because they couldn't integrate. And then we exported the criminals back to Central America and fed a cycle of violence that really continues to this day. So in what I think, my opinion, is what we have at the border is not a border crisis, not an immigration crisis, but a humanitarian crisis. We have large numbers of women and children who have replaced large numbers of Mexican labor migrants who are mostly males. And these women and children are migrating not for labor purposes, but to escape often very horrendous conditions in their homeland. So these are the official statistics of number of family units and unaccompanied minors apprehended by year. And you can see it's family units have been growing, and children kind of peak in 2013 and again in 2016, and they may be peaking in 2018. We're not done with the data yet for this year. But instead of labor migrants, now what we see on the border is really families, women and children, trying to leave Central America because we messed it up. And it's a Central American problem, not a Mexican problem. This is the national origin composition of families and unaccompanied minors apprehended in 2018. You can see that Mexicans are a very small number of families and minors who are becoming the predominant component of people that are showing up at the border. They're labeled illegal migrants, but they're actually coming and they want to claim asylum. But we're not following our own rules and allowing them to claim asylum and have that case judged. They're being arrested as illegal migrants and thrown into prisons. And right as we speak, they're cleansing all the prisons that have had the children, and they've built a tent city somewhere in Texas, and they put about 1,500 or 1,600 kids in this tent city. And it's away from the press. They're trying to keep it very quiet. So what kind of a country locks up women and children who are trying to escape violence is my question. The immigration detention system is now the fastest growing component of the prison industrial complex. 2/3 of the prison system, the immigration detention system, is privately owned and managed by GeoCorp, or what used to be called Corrections Corporation of America, now rebranded itself as Core Civic. The stockholders in these are members of the Carlyle Group, which was made up of old Bush administration employees who make a lot of money investing in companies that do contract work for the government. And Core Civic and GeoCorp in 2009 successfully lobbied Congress to set a quota of 24,000 beds that needed to be filled every day, every night, with arrested undocumented migrants. So right now, even if undocumented migration would stop completely and there weren't any left in the United States, they would be compelled to go out and try to find some because they have a bed quota that they have to fill irrespective of conditions. And you can see the rapid growth in the size. This is the average daily population. And these daily populations translate into 350 to 400,000 people going through the system in any given year. So I kind of framed Trump doubling down on the bet, the border enforcement, despite all the evidence that it didn't work in the past, it backfired in the past, didn't increase the likelihood of apprehension, didn't stop people from getting into the country, it didn't prevent them from leaving on an undocumented trip. What it did was prevent them from going home, and actually increased by 83% the size of the undocumented population. Despite all that, we're doubling down on that bet. And it's like a drunk at a Las Vegas casino who thinks he can double up to catch up. And we have some sobering conclusions from the analysis. After 1986, the U.S. militarized its border with Mexico at a cumulative cost of $62 billion and 8,600 lives at least. That's probably an underestimate. The militarization effort proved massively inefficient and wasteful, decreasing the number of apprehensions per agent from 477 to 16, while raising the cost per apprehension from $98 to $12,500. Border militarization had no real effect on the likelihood of apprehension, and little effect on the probability of ultimately getting entry. Border militarization did divert border crossings away from traditional entry points. The costs and risks of border crossing had no effect on the likelihood of taking our first undocumented trip. And undocumented migration effectively ended in 2007 and has been negative ever since. Border apprehensions are at their lowest rate since 1971. Prior to 1980, there was little documented or undocumented migration from Central America to the United States. The U.S. military and political intervention destroyed the economies of frontline nations in the Contra War and unleashed mass killings. In response to violence and economic lack of economic opportunity, migrants from the region are seeking entry to the United States, where most have relatives. Central Americans arriving at the border are not laborers seeking work, but families and children seeking refuge. The arrival of these people is a humanitarian crisis, and treating it as an immigration crisis does not solve the underlying problem, and it creates great human misery, separating women, mothers from children, breaking up families, ruining people's lives. The humanitarian problems prevailing along the border are best addressed by legalizing the 11 million documented residents who are already present, and then processing arrivals at the border as refugees and asylees who can reunite with legalized family members. The United States once messed up another country in Southeast Asia, in the Vietnam War, and we ended up with 500,000 or 600,000 boat people, which we took in because we felt a moral obligation. And we have incorporated successfully for the most part. Certain outlier groups like the Hmong, who were an illiterate hunting and gathering population before they started working for the CIA, haven't fared as well, but the Vietnamese have integrated pretty well. We bit the bullet and treated it like a humanitarian crisis. But having really broken the countries in Central America and having broken the Middle East, we are not honoring our moral obligations to those countries. And it's even so extreme that people that were promised asylum in the U.S., if they worked for the U.S. Armed Forces during the Iraqi War, as translators, as people on bases, as service workers, they're being denied entry into the United States and facing very uncertain prospects in their lives. I think the Trump administration has lowered the number of refugee slots to around 30,000, which is the lowest level it's been in decades, even though the demand for such slots is at record levels, both from our adventures in the Middle East and from our misadventures in Central America. And ultimately, spending $25 billion on our border wall is not going to solve any of our problems anywhere, at the border or in the interior of the United States. And so let us remember that talking about building a wall, there's already a wall. And it's about 750 miles worth of the border of a 2,000-mile border is already walled. And this is what various parts of the border look like. This is near Tijuana. These are corrugated iron pieces that were put down for temporary tarmac on the airstrips during the Gulf War. And then after the Gulf War, they packed up, shipped to Tijuana, where they became the border wall. So that's it.